I need to tell you something that happened to me. Something that still keeps me awake at night, wondering if I'm truly alive or if I've already crossed over into a world I never believed existed. This isn't a fairy tale. This isn't some romantic fantasy about sparkling vampires or brooding immortals who sparkle in the sun. This is real. This is what happened when I found him bleeding on the side of the road, when I saved his life, or maybe when he saved mine. My name is Eleanor. People call me Ellie. I'm 32 years old, and until 6 months ago, I was a trauma surgeon at St. Catherine's Hospital in Portland. I had a routine. I had a life. I had rules. Rule number 1 was simple: never stop for strangers on dark roads. But that night, that cold October night with rain hammering down like the sky itself wanted to wash away every trace of what was about to happen, I broke that rule. I was driving home from a 14-hour shift. My hands were shaking on the wheel, not from exhaustion, but from what I'd witnessed that day. A child, 7 years old. We'd fought for 3 hours to save her, and we'd lost. I'd held that tiny hand as the monitors flatlined, and something inside me had cracked. Maybe that's why I saw him. Maybe that's why I couldn't just drive past. He was lying on the shoulder of Highway 26, just beyond the bridge, where the trees crowd in so thick you can barely see the moon. At first, I thought it was a deer. But then my headlights caught him, and I saw the shape of a man sprawled face down in the mud. One arm stretched out like he'd been reaching for something before he fell. I should have called 911. I should have stayed in my car and waited for someone else to handle it. But I'm a doctor. It's wired into me, that instinct to help. So I pulled over, grabbed my emergency kit from the trunk, and ran to him through the rain. The moment I touched him, I knew something was wrong. His skin was cold. Not cold like someone who'd been lying in the rain for an hour. Cold like marble. Cold like death. But he had a pulse. Faint. Impossibly slow. Maybe 10 beats per minute. No one survives with a heart rate that low. I rolled him over, and that's when I saw the blood. So much blood. It covered his chest, soaked through what looked like an expensive white shirt torn to ribbons. The wounds underneath were deep. Claw marks, I thought at first. 4 parallel gashes running from his collarbone to his stomach. But as I pressed my hands against them to stop the bleeding, I realized they weren't from claws. They were too precise, too deliberate. His face, though, even covered in mud and blood, his face was beautiful. Sharp cheekbones, a strong jaw, lips that looked like they'd been carved by someone who understood symmetry on a molecular level. And his eyes, when they flickered open for just a second, were the strangest color I'd ever seen. Not quite red, not quite gold. Amber, maybe. Like honey held up to firelight. He whispered something I couldn't hear over the rain, then passed out again. I made a decision in that moment that would change everything. I couldn't take him to the hospital. I couldn't explain wounds like these. Couldn't explain why his body temperature was barely 90 degrees. Couldn't explain why he should be dead but wasn't. So I did something I'd never done before. I took him home. Getting him into my house was harder than I'd expected. He was tall, maybe 6'2", and even unconscious, he had this weight to him that felt wrong. Not heavy, just dense, like his bones were made of something heavier than calcium. I managed to drag him through my front door and into the guest bedroom, the one I'd been meaning to repaint for 3 years, but never had time for. I cut away what was left of his shirt and started cleaning the wounds. That's when things got strange. Really strange. The gashes that had been gaping open when I found him were already closing. Not healing slowly, like a normal wound. Closing. The flesh was knitting itself back together while I watched, like watching a time-lapse video of plant growth. Within 20 minutes, all that remained were 4 thin, red lines. My medical training had no explanation for this. My rational brain kept trying to supply one anyway. Maybe I'd misjudged the severity. Maybe the rain had washed away most of the blood and made the wounds look worse than they were. Maybe I was more exhausted than I'd realized. and my perception was off. But deep down, in a place I didn't want to acknowledge, I knew I wasn't wrong. I knew what I'd seen. I stayed with him that night, sat in the chair by the bed and watched him not breathing, or barely breathing. His chest would rise maybe once every 5 minutes, and each time I'd lean forward, convinced this would be the last one. But it never was. He just kept existing in this impossible state between life and death. Around dawn, he opened his eyes. Really opened them. And this time, I got a good look at that impossible color. It wasn't amber. It was more complex than that. Red around the edges, like embers dying in a fire. Gold in the center, like honey mixed with sunlight. And when he looked at me, I felt seen in a way I'd never experienced before. Not evaluated. Not examined. Seen. Like he could read every thought I'd ever had just by meeting my eyes. This spoke, and his voice was rough, like he hadn't used it in years. He told me his name was Lucian Ashford. He told me I shouldn't have brought him here, that I'd put myself in danger by doing so. He told me he was grateful anyway, even though gratitude meant nothing from someone like him. When I asked him what he meant by someone like him, he just looked at me with those strange eyes and said I'd figure it out soon enough. I should have been afraid. Any rational person would have been. But I wasn't. Or maybe I was, and the exhaustion was overriding the fear. I told him he needed to rest, that his wounds needed time to heal properly, even if they'd closed faster than anything I'd ever witnessed. He smiled at that, actually smiled, and his teeth looked normal, human. That made me relax a little, though I couldn't have said why. He asked me why I'd stopped, why I'd risked my safety for a stranger. I told him about the little girl, about holding her hand as she died, about how I couldn't bear the thought of passing by someone else who might still be saved. He listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he reached out and touched my hand. His fingers were still cold, but not unpleasantly so, like touching cool silk. He told me I had a good heart, that kindness like mine was rare in the world, that I deserved better than the loneliness I wrapped around myself like armor. I didn't know how he knew about the loneliness. I'd never told anyone about that, about how I'd thrown myself into work to avoid dealing with the fact that I hadn't had a real relationship in 5 years, hadn't let anyone close enough to hurt me since my father died. But somehow Lucian knew, and somehow I didn't mind him knowing. He stayed for 3 days before I saw what he really was. 3 days of him sleeping in the guest room, barely eating the food I brought him, speaking in that low voice that made my chest tighten every time he used my name. 3 days of me going to work and coming home to find him sitting in the dark, reading books from my shelves by what little moonlight came through the window. 3 days of pretending everything was normal when nothing was normal at all. On the 4th night, I came home to find him standing in front of the bathroom mirror with his shirt off, or trying to. He was staring at his reflection with this expression of profound sadness, and it took me a moment to realize what was wrong. The mirror was showing the bathroom behind him, the towels, the shower curtain, everything except him. There was just an empty space where his reflection should have been. I must have made a sound, because he turned to face me. There was no attempt to hide it, no effort to explain it away. He just looked at me with those ember and gold eyes and waited for me to understand. And I did. God help me, I understood. All the pieces fell into place. The cold skin, the impossible healing, the barely, their heartbeat, the missing reflection. I asked him to say it. I needed to hear him say it. He told me he was a vampire. He'd been one for almost 300 years. The wounds I'd found him with had been inflicted by others of his kind, ones who believed he'd broken their most sacred law. I asked him what law that was, even though part of me didn't want to know. He said it simply, without emotion. He'd refused to feed on humans for the past 40 years. I should have run. Should have called someone, though who would I call? The police? And tell them what? that I'd been harboring an injured vampire in my guest room. They'd have me committed. Instead, I sat down on my couch and asked him to tell me everything, and he did. He told me about his transformation in 1723 in a small village in France that no longer existed, about waking up 3 days after his death to find his maker standing over him, explaining the curse he now carried, about learning to hunt, to feed, to survive in a world that would destroy him if it knew what he was. About the Council, the group of ancient vampires who enforced their laws with brutal efficiency. He told me about the guilt that had consumed him after his first century, about the faces of the people he'd killed, the lives he'd stolen to sustain his own, about the decision he'd made 40 years ago to stop feeding on humans entirely, to sustain himself on animal blood even though it left him weak, constantly hungry, barely able to function, about how the Council had seen this as weakness, as betrayal, as setting a dangerous example for younger vampires. They'd sent hunters after him, 3 of them, each centuries old, each powerful enough to tear him apart. They'd found him in Seattle, and they'd nearly succeeded in killing him. He'd escaped, barely, and he'd been running when his strength finally gave out on that highway. He'd been prepared to die there. Wanted to die, actually. After 300 years of existence, he was tired. So tired of watching everyone he'd ever cared about age and die while he remained frozen in time. I asked him why he'd told me all this, why he was trusting me with information that could get him killed. He said it was because I deserved to know what I'd brought into my home, because keeping secrets from someone who'd shown him such kindness felt like another kind of death, and because, for the first time in decades, he'd felt something close to hope when he looked at me. I didn't know what to say to that. Part of me was terrified. Part of me wanted to believe he was delusional, that there was some rational explanation for everything I'd witnessed. But the largest part, the part one was most afraid to acknowledge, believed him completely. And more than that, I wanted to help him. The weeks that followed were the strangest of my life. Lucian stayed with me, and we fell into a routine that felt almost normal. I'd go to work during the day while he rested in the guest room with the blackout curtains drawn. I'd come home to find him reading, or sometimes cooking, which amused me given that he couldn't actually eat the food. He said he remembered the process, enjoyed the act of creation even if he couldn't enjoy the result. We'd talk for hours after I got home. He'd tell me stories about the world before electricity, before cars, before the internet had connected everyone while somehow making them more alone. He'd describe Napoleon's coronation, which he'd witnessed from the shadows of Notre Dame. The opening night of the Rite of Spring in 1913, where he'd been in the audience when the riot broke out. The fall of the Berlin Wall, where he'd watched humans tear down the barrier between East and West with their bare hands and wept at their determination. I'd tell him about my life, which felt so small in comparison, about growing up in Michigan with parents who'd encouraged my love of science, about losing my mother to cancer when I was 19, and watching my father fade away without her until he died of what the doctors called a heart attack, but I knew was a broken heart, about choosing surgery because I needed to feel like I could save people, could undo the deaths I hadn't been able to prevent. He listened like every word mattered. My 32 years of ordinary human life were just as fascinating as his 3 centuries of immortal existence. And slowly, without meaning to, I started falling for him. Not because he was beautiful, though he was. Not because he was mysterious, though that was certainly part of it. But because he saw me. Really saw me. The lonely parts, the broken parts, the parts I'd kept hidden from everyone else. And he didn't look away. I noticed he was getting weaker. He moved slower, spoke less. Sometimes I'd catch him staring at nothing with this look of profound hunger in his eyes that made my heart race for reasons I didn't want to examine. When I asked him about it, he admitted he hadn't fed in weeks. The animal blood that had been sustaining him was no longer enough. His body was starting to shut down, going into a kind of hibernation that would eventually become permanent. I asked him why he didn't just feed, why he was choosing to die rather than take what he needed to survive. He told me about a girl he'd killed in 1982, Marina. She'd been 19 years old, a student at Columbia University, walking home from the library late at night. He'd been weak then, too, had convinced himself he could take just a little, just enough to survive without killing her. But once he started, he couldn't stop. He'd drained her completely, left her body in an alley for someone else to find. He said he still dreamed about her every time he closed his eyes. Still heard her heartbeat slowing down, felt her life pouring into him while he was powerless to stop himself. He'd sworn after that night he'd never feed on a human again, no matter what it cost him. He'd rather die than become that monster one more time. Something shifted in me when he told me that story. The last bit of fear I'd been holding on to melted away, and all that remained was a fierce protectiveness I didn't fully understand. This man, this creature, this impossible being who'd lived for 3 centuries and seen empires rise and fall, was choosing death over becoming the thing he hated. How could I not help him? How could I let him fade away when I had the power to save him? It happened on a Tuesday night, 3 months after I'd found him. I came home from a particularly brutal shift to find him collapsed on the bathroom floor. He'd tried to stand, he'd told me later, and his legs had simply given out. His skin had lost all color, looked almost translucent. When I checked his pulse, I could barely find it, maybe 3 beats per minute. I got him to the couch and tried to think. There had to be something I could do. Blood banks required too much explanation, too many questions I couldn't answer. Animal blood wasn't enough anymore. That left only one option, and the moment I thought it, I knew I was going to do it. I was going to offer myself. He refused, of course. Told me I didn't understand what I was offering, what it would mean, that he couldn't guarantee he'd be able to stop once he started. That I'd be putting my life in his hands, trusting a monster who'd proven he couldn't always control himself. I told him I trusted him anyway, that I'd rather take the risk than watch him die when I could prevent it. We argued for an hour. His voice got weaker with every word, and I knew I was running out of time. Finally, I did something I'd never done before. I kissed him, pressed my lips against his cold mouth and poured every bit of feeling I'd been holding back into that kiss. All the loneliness, the fear, the strange aching warmth I felt whenever he looked at me. All of it. He kissed me back. His hands came up to cup my face, cold fingers trembling against my skin. When we pulled apart, his eyes had darkened, the gold almost completely swallowed by red. His breathing had quickened, and I could feel the tension in his body, the war between his hunger and his control. I tilted my head, exposing my throat. Told him it was okay. Told him I wanted this, wanted to save him. His hands tightened on my face, and for a moment, I thought he'd refuse again. But then his resolve crumbled. He pulled me closer, his mouth finding the pulse point in my neck, and I felt his teeth pierce my skin. It didn't hurt. That was the first surprise. It felt like warmth spreading through my veins, like sinking into a hot bath after a long day. I felt his mouth working against my neck, felt my blood flowing out of me and into him, and instead of terror, all I felt was peace. This was right. This was what I was meant to do. I closed my eyes and let it happen. He took more than he should have. I knew it even in that moment, felt myself getting weaker, my heartbeat slowing, but he didn't drain me completely. Somehow, through whatever remained of his control, he managed to stop. Pulled away from my neck with blood on his lips and his eyes wild, pressed his hand against the wound to stop the bleeding. I could see the agony in his expression, the self-hatred warring with the relief of finally being fed. I passed out then. When I woke up, it was morning. I was in my bed with Lucian sitting beside me, his hand clasped around mine. The color had returned to his skin. His eyes had faded back to that amber gold, with just a hint of red at the edges. He looked like he'd been crying, though I knew vampires couldn't produce tears. He told me I'd saved his life, that he'd been hours away from death, and the blood I'd given him had pulled him back from the edge. He also told me it was the most selfless and most foolish thing anyone had ever done for him, that I should hate him for what he'd done, for taking so much when he'd promised himself he never would again. I told him I didn't hate him. I could never hate him, and I kissed him again, tasting my own blood on his lips and not caring. The month after that was the happiest of my life. Lucian was strong again, moving with that impossible grace I'd only glimpsed before. He smiled more, laughed at my jokes. We fell into a routine that felt like the beginning of forever. I'd come home from work and find him waiting, and we'd spend our evenings talking, cooking together even though he couldn't eat, watching old movies on my laptop. He never fed from me again. Refused every time I offered. Said he couldn't bear the thought of taking more from me when I'd already given so much. Instead, he went out at night, found what he needed in ways he wouldn't explain and I didn't ask about. I told myself he was being careful, that he was keeping his promise not to kill. I chose to believe him. We became more than friends, though we never defined what we were. He'd hold me while we watched movies, his cold arms wrapped around me in a way that had become comforting rather than strange. Sometimes I'd wake up in the middle of the night to find him in my doorway, just watching me sleep with this expression of wonder on his face. When I asked him why, he said he was memorizing me. Every detail. The way I breathed, the way I moved in my sleep, the way morning light caught in my hair. He said he wanted to remember me exactly as I was in these perfect moments, before the world caught up with us. I should have paid attention to that. I should have heard the warning in his words, but I was too happy, too wrapped up in this impossible romance that felt like it had been pulled from the pages of a story. I let myself believe we could make this work, that somehow we could build a life together despite everything that should have made it impossible. He told me about the places he wanted to show me. Paris in springtime when the cherry blossoms bloomed along the Seine, the northern lights in Iceland, where he'd spent a winter alone in the 19th century, the ancient temples of Kyoto, which he'd visited during Japan's Edo period. He talked about the future like it was something we'd share, and I let myself believe it. But in the quiet moments, I'd catch him staring at nothing with worry in his eyes. He'd check the windows compulsively, always making sure the curtains were drawn. Sometimes he'd go still, his head tilted like he was listening to something I couldn't hear. When I asked him what was wrong, he'd smile and tell me it was nothing, that he was just being paranoid. But I knew him well enough by then to know when he was lying. The truth was, he'd been found. The council knew where he was, and they were planning something. He didn't tell me this at the time, kept it to himself, trying to protect me from the danger his presence had brought into my life. But I'd figure it out soon enough. We both would. I was sleeping when they broke down my front door. The sound yanked me from a dream, and for a moment I was disoriented, not sure what I'd heard. Then I heard Lucian shout my name, heard the crash of furniture being overturned, and I was running down the hallway in my pajamas before I'd fully processed what was happening. There were 3 of them in my living room, 2 men and a woman, all beautiful in that terrible way that vampires are, beautiful like poisonous flowers, like knife blades catching the light. They had Lucian pinned against the wall, and even with 3 of them holding him, he was fighting. I saw his face, saw the fury there, the desperation. He was trying to reach me. The woman was the first to notice me. She had white blonde hair and eyes like ice, and when she smiled, her fangs were fully extended. She told me I must be the human, the one who'd been hiding their wayward brother. She said it like it was amusing, like I was a child playing at something I didn't understand. Then she asked me if I knew what the penalty was for harboring a rogue vampire. Lucian told her to leave me alone. Screamed it. Said I had nothing to do with his choices, that I was innocent. The woman laughed and told him that innocence meant nothing to the council, that I'd seen too much, knew too much, that the kindest thing they could do was make it quick. I didn't have time to be afraid. One of the men released Lucian and moved toward me so fast I couldn't track the motion. One moment he was across the room, the next his hand was wrapped around my throat, lifting me off my feet. I couldn't breathe, couldn't scream, could only stare into his black eyes and know that this was how I died. Then Lucian was there. He'd broken free somehow, thrown off the two vampires, holding him with a strength that I hadn't known he possessed. He hit the vampire, holding me with enough force to send us both flying. I crashed into the wall and felt something crack in my ribs, but the hand around my throat was gone and I could breathe again. What followed was chaos. The four vampires fought in my living room, moving too fast for my human eyes to fully process. I saw flashes of violence, heard the sound of bodies hitting walls, furniture shattering. Lucian was outnumbered and should have been overpowered, but he fought like something possessed, like he had nothing left to lose. He was losing. I could see it even through the blur of motion. The three council vampires were coordinating their attacks, wearing him down. The woman managed to get behind him, wrapped her arm around his throat. The two men closed in from the front. They were going to tear him apart right there in front of me. I don't remember deciding to move. One moment I was slumped against the wall trying to breathe through my broken ribs. The next I was grabbing the fireplace poker and running at them. I swung at the nearest vampire with everything I had. The iron connected with his temple, and he stumbled. It was only for a second, but it was enough. Lucian used the distraction to break the woman's hold, to put himself between me and the others. He told me to run. His voice was different, rougher, like something fundamental had changed in him. When he turned to look at me, his eyes were completely red. No gold, no amber, just red like fresh blood. And his fangs were longer than I'd ever seen them, more like a wolf's teeth than anything human. I understood then what he'd been holding back all this time. This was what he really was beneath the gentle artist who cooked meals he couldn't eat, beneath the scholar who read my books and told me stories. This was the predator that had survived 300 years, and he was terrifying. But I didn't run. I stayed right where I was, fireplace poker still clutched in my hand, and I told him I wasn't leaving him. The council vampires laughed at that. Said it was touching, the humans' loyalty. Said it wouldn't matter. They'd kill us both, and report to the council that the rogue had been eliminated along with his accomplice. Lucian didn't wait for them to finish talking. He moved, and this time there was nothing controlled about it. He was a storm of violence, all precision and fury. I watched him tear into the council vampires with a ferocity that should have terrified me. Maybe it did, but stronger than the fear was relief, because for the first time since they'd broken down my door, I thought we might actually survive this. The fight lasted maybe 5 minutes, though it felt like hours. When it was over, the 3 council vampires were unconscious on my floor, and Lucian was standing over them, breathing hard. There was blood on his hands, his face, his clothes. Some of it was his own. Most of it wasn't, and his eyes were still that terrible red. He looked at me and I saw the war happening behind those eyes. The thing he'd become to protect me, fighting with the man who'd sworn never to be that thing again. I took a step toward him, and he flinched. Actually flinched, like he was afraid of what he might do if I got too close. But I kept walking, closed the distance between us, and took his blood-covered hands in mine. Told him I wasn't afraid of him, that I understood why he'd done what he had, that I would have done the same if our positions were reversed, that he'd saved my life, and I would never forget that. He pulled away from me, and I saw tears in his eyes. Impossible tears, because vampires weren't supposed to be able to cry, but there they were anyway. He told me he was sorry, that he'd broken his vow, had let the monster win, had become exactly what he'd spent 40 years trying not to be. He said he'd done it for me, but that didn't make it any less true. He was a killer again. I told him he was wrong, that defending someone you love doesn't make you a monster. That choosing to protect instead of destroy is exactly what makes you human, or as close to human as someone like him could be. I used that word, love, and I saw something shift in his expression. Hope, maybe. Or fear that this couldn't possibly end well. He kissed me then, hard and desperate, like he was trying to memorize the taste of my lips, the warmth of my breath. His hands cupped my face, and I could feel them shaking. When we pulled apart, his eyes had started to fade back to amber, the red receding to just the edges. He looked like himself again, or close enough. Then he told me we had to leave, that the council would send more vampires when these three didn't report back, that staying here would mean both our deaths. He had a place, he said, a safe house in northern Canada that none of the council knew about. We could go there, hide, figure out our next move. But we had to leave right now, before dawn. I looked around my living room, at the shattered furniture, the blood on the walls, the three unconscious vampires on my floor. At the life I'd built here, the career I'd worked so hard for, the normalcy I'd clung to, and I realized I didn't care about any of it. Not compared to him, not compared to the impossible, terrifying, beautiful thing we'd found together. I told him yes, that I'd go anywhere with him, that I'd leave everything behind if it meant we could be together. He looked at me like I'd just given him the world, and maybe I had. We packed quickly, throwing clothes and necessities into bags while the council vampires remained unconscious. Lucian said they'd wake up in a few hours, and when they did, they'd come after us with everything they had. We needed to be long gone by then. We drove through the night. Lucian was at the wheel of my car, pushing it faster than it should have gone, his hands steady despite everything that had happened. I sat in the passenger seat with my broken ribs wrapped in bandages I'd grabbed from my medical supplies, watching the city lights fade behind us as we headed north. He told me about the safe house as we drove. It had been his refuge for decades, a place he'd retreat to when the world became too much. It was isolated, surrounded by forest, with no neighbors for miles. Solar panels for electricity, a well for water, everything we'd need to survive off the grid. He'd stocked it with supplies years ago, hoping he'd never need them. Now, he was grateful he had. I asked him what we'd do once we got there, how long we could hide before the council found us. He was quiet for a long time before answering. He said he didn't know, that the council had resources beyond anything I could imagine, centuries of accumulated power and influence. They'd find us eventually, but every day we had before that happened was a gift. Every moment we carved out for ourselves was a victory. I reached over and took his hand, felt that familiar coolness, the strength in his fingers as they wrapped around mine. I told him I wasn't afraid, that as long as we were together, I could face anything. He squeezed my hand and said he'd spent 300 years waiting to hear someone say that I'd given him something he'd thought he'd lost forever, hope for the future. We crossed into Canada as the sun was rising. Lucian had to pull over and hide in the trunk for the daylight hours, and I drove the rest of the way alone, following the GPS coordinates he'd given me. The road got rougher as I went farther north, paved highways giving way to dirt roads that barely qualified as roads at all. I found the cabin just as the sun was setting. It was exactly as he'd described it. Small, sturdy, hidden in a clearing surrounded by pine trees that seemed to go on forever. I helped him out of the trunk, and we stood together looking at the place that would be our sanctuary, our prison, our home. Inside, it was Spartan, but functional. One bedroom, a small kitchen, a living area with a wood stove for heat. Lucian showed me where everything was, how the solar system worked, where he'd hidden the supplies. He moved through the space like he'd done this 100 times before, and I realized he'd probably had. This was what his life had been before me, running, hiding, always looking over his shoulder. That first night, we sat by the wood stove and just held each other. I was exhausted from the drive and the pain in my ribs, but I couldn't sleep. Every sound made me jump, convinced it was the council coming for us. Lucian must have felt my tension because he pulled me closer and started humming something soft and old. A lullaby, maybe, from a time before I was born. I asked him to tell me a story, anything to distract me from the fear. He thought for a moment, then started talking about Venice in the 1780s, about the carnival masks and the gondolas, about sneaking through the canals at night and watching humans celebrate like they didn't have a care in the world, about meeting a painter there who'd captured something in his work that Lucian had thought was lost to him. Joy. He said he'd been trying to find that feeling again for over 200 years, that he'd traveled the world, seen every wonder humanity had created, and none of it had made him feel the way that painters' work had. Until now. Until me. Said when he looked at me, he saw that same joy, that same light that made existence feel like something more than just survival. I fell asleep in his arms that night, and for the first time since the council vampires had broken down my door, I felt safe. The weeks that followed were the most surreal of my life. We existed in this bubble, cut off from the rest of the world, just the two of us and the endless forest. During the day, while Lucian slept, I'd explore the woods around the cabin. I'd find clearings where the sunlight came through the trees in shafts of gold, streams where the water ran so clear you could see every stone on the bottom. It was beautiful in a way that made my chest ache. At night, we'd talk. He'd teach me things he'd learned over 3 centuries. Languages I'd never heard of, history that wasn't in any textbook. He showed me how to track animals through the forest, how to read the stars for navigation, how to move silently through the underbrush. Skills from a time before GPS and modern convenience, skills he'd accumulated out of necessity. I'd tell him about modern medicine, about the breakthroughs happening in surgery and pharmacology, about stem cell research and CRISPR, and all the ways humans were trying to cheat death. He'd listen with genuine interest, asking questions that showed he understood the science better than most of my colleagues. Sometimes I'd forget he wasn't human, that the heart beating in his chest was a relic from another age. We made love for the first time under the northern lights. It was late October, and the sky had exploded in ribbons of green and purple that danced across the darkness. Lucian had taken me outside to see them, wrapped a blanket around both our shoulders as we stood in the clearing and watched the show. He told me he'd seen the aurora borealis hundreds of times, but never with someone he loved. That sharing it with me made it new again, made him remember why he'd fought so hard to stay in this world. I turned in his arms and kissed him, and the rest happened naturally, urgently, like we both knew our time was limited and wanted to make every moment count. His skin was cold against mine, but I didn't mind. Actually, I loved it. Loved the contrast between us, warm and cold, living and something beyond death. He was gentle with me, careful of my healing ribs, but there was an intensity to it that left me breathless, like he was trying to pour 300 years of loneliness into this one connection. Afterward, we lay in the grass and watched the lights continue their dance overhead. He held me against his chest, and I listened to his heart beating its slow, impossible rhythm. I told him I loved him, said it clearly, without reservation, even though I knew it was crazy to love someone who'd lived 3 centuries, who'd killed people to survive, who was being hunted by an organization that wouldn't stop until he was dead. He said he loved me too, that in all his years of existence, he'd never felt for anyone what he felt for me, that I'd reminded him what it meant to be human, to care about someone more than himself. That if he died tomorrow, he'd die grateful for having known me. I made him promise not to die tomorrow, or the next day, or ever if he could help it. He smiled and said he'd do his best. We had almost 3 months. 3 months of peace in our hidden cabin. 3 months of pretending we could stay there forever. Then on a Tuesday morning in early January, everything changed. I'd gone out to gather firewood while Lucien slept. It was a clear day, cold but beautiful, with snow covering everything in pristine white. I was about 50 yards from the cabin when I saw them. Footprints. Fresh ones. Too large to be mine, too deliberate to be an animal's. They led straight to our door. I dropped the firewood and ran back to the cabin, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I burst through the door, calling Lucien's name, and found him already awake, already standing by the window with that terrible stillness that meant he'd sensed danger. He told me we had to leave immediately, that there were 5 vampires in the forest, closing in on our location. He could sense them, feel their presence like pressure on his mind. The council had sent an entire hunting party this time. They weren't taking any chances. We grabbed what we could and ran. The forest was thick with snow, and it slowed me down even as Lucien moved through it like it wasn't there. He kept looking back at me, his face tight with worry, and I knew he was calculating. Wondering if he could carry me and still move fast enough to escape. Wondering if he'd have to make a choice between his life and mine. We didn't make it far. They appeared in front of us so suddenly it was like they'd materialized from the air itself. 5 vampires, all ancient by the look of them, all moving with that predatory grace that made my survival instincts scream. They spread out, surrounding us, cutting off any escape route. The one in the center stepped forward. He was tall, with dark hair and eyes like black ice. He addressed Lucien formally, calling him by his full name, Lucien Ashford, formerly of the House of Laurent. Said he'd been charged by the council to execute judgment for crimes against vampire law. The penalty was death, to be carried out immediately. Lucien told him I had nothing to do with this. That I was an innocent human who'd been manipulated, that I deserved to live. The leader looked at me with something like pity and said the council didn't recognize innocence in this matter, that I'd chosen to harbor a rogue to help him evade justice. That made me complicit, that made me just as guilty. I stepped forward and Lucien tried to pull me back, but I shook him off. I told the council vampires they were wrong, that Lucien wasn't a criminal. He was one of the most moral people I'd ever known, that refusing to kill innocent humans wasn't a crime. It was evolution. That they were the ones who should be ashamed, hunting down someone for trying to be better than what nature made him. The leader looked amused by my little speech. He told me I didn't understand vampire nature, didn't comprehend the delicate balance they maintained. That humans were prey, nothing more. That pretending otherwise was dangerous, would lead to chaos and exposure. The old ways had survived for millennia because they worked. Lucien's defiance threatened all of that. Lucien told him the old ways were built on murder and fear, that the world had changed and vampires needed to change with it or eventually they'd be hunted to extinction, that he'd rather die trying to be better than live forever as a monster. The leader said that could be arranged. What happened next happened fast. The 5 vampires moved as one, converging on Lucien with lethal precision. He fought back, and I saw again the terrible beauty of what he could do when he wasn't holding back. But he was outnumbered and outmatched. These were older vampires, stronger, with centuries more experience. They tore into him, and I watched helplessly as the man I loved was overwhelmed. I don't know what made me do it. Maybe desperation. Maybe love. Maybe just the stubborn refusal to stand by while someone I cared about was destroyed. I ran at them, screaming, throwing myself into the fight even though I knew it was suicide. I managed to grab one vampire's arm, pull his attention away from Lucien for just a second. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Lucien used the distraction to break free. He grabbed me and we ran, moving so fast the trees blurred around us. I realized he was carrying me, my feet not even touching the ground, as he pushed himself to speeds I didn't know he could reach. Behind us, I could hear the other vampires giving chase, their footsteps impossibly close no matter how fast we went. We came to a cliff. The edge dropped away into darkness, a river far below cutting through the frozen landscape. Lucian set me down and turned to face the 5 vampires emerging from the trees. They formed a semicircle, blocking any escape route except the cliff behind us. The leader smiled and said it was over. That we could die fighting or die running, but either way, we'd die. Lucian looked at me, and I saw everything in his eyes. Love, regret, determination. He told me he was sorry, that he'd never meant to bring me into this world, that I deserved better than dying in the snow for a vampire's mistake. I told him I'd chosen this, that I'd choose it again, that loving him was worth whatever came after. Then he did something I didn't expect. He kissed me, hard and desperate, and in that kiss I tasted blood. My blood. He'd bitten his own tongue, mixed his blood with mine in that kiss, and I understood what he was doing even as I felt the change beginning. He was turning me, right there with the council vampires watching. He was transforming me into what he was. The leader roared in fury, and the 5 vampires rushed us. But Lucian was ready. He grabbed me around the waist and stepped backward, off the cliff, pulling us both into empty air. So we fell together, the wind screaming around us, the vampires' shouts fading above. I saw Lucian's face inches from mine, saw him mouth the words, "I love you," and then we hit the water. The river was freezing, strong enough to sweep us away from where we'd landed. I felt Lucian's arms around me, keeping my head above water even as the current pulled at us. The world was spinning, ice and darkness and the taste of blood in my mouth. I tried to stay conscious, tried to help, but the cold was too much. I felt myself slipping away, and the last thing I remembered was Lucian's voice telling me to hold on, that it would be okay, that we'd survive this together. I died in that river. I know I did. I felt my heart stop, felt the cold seep into my bones until there was nothing left but darkness. I should have stayed dead, should have drifted away into whatever comes after, should have been free of the pain and the fear and the impossible love that had led me here. But Lucian wouldn't let me go. I woke up 3 days later in a cave. The transformation was complete by then, and the world I opened my eyes to was different than the one I'd left. Colors were sharper, sounds were clearer, and I could hear everything. The drip of water from the cave ceiling, the flutter of bat wings somewhere in the darkness. Lucian's heartbeat slow and steady as he sat beside me waiting for me to wake. He told me what had happened, how he'd pulled me from the river and found this cave to hide in, how he'd given me more of his blood to complete the transformation, held me while my body died and was reborn into something new, how he'd stayed awake for 3 days straight, terrified I wouldn't wake up, that he'd lost me after all. I should have been angry, should have raged at him for taking away my humanity without asking, for making a decision that would affect me for eternity. But I wasn't angry, because I understood why he'd done it. It was the only way to save me, the only way to give us a chance at surviving together. And now that it was done, now that I could feel the power thrumming through my new body, I couldn't bring myself to regret it. The hunger came later. That terrible, consuming hunger that Lucian had described, but I hadn't truly understood until I felt it myself. It was like having my insides hollowed out, like every cell in my body was screaming for something I didn't have. Lucian held me through it, talked me through it, told me it would pass. But the first weeks were the worst, but I'd learned to control it. I had to. He taught me to hunt. We went out together in the darkness, and he showed me how to track animals by sound and scent, how to take what I needed without causing unnecessary suffering. The first time I fed from a deer, I wept. Not from guilt, though there was some of that, but from relief. The hunger receded, replaced by a warmth that felt almost like being human again. Almost. We stayed in that cave for a month while I adjusted to my new existence. Lucian was patient, answering every question, helping me understand the changes my body had undergone. He taught me to control my strength, to move with the unnatural grace that came with being a vampire, to navigate the world with senses that could perceive things humans couldn't imagine. But mostly, we just held each other, because we'd survived. Against all odds, against the Council's hunters and the river and death itself, we'd survived. And now we had forever to figure out what came next. The Council believes we're dead. Lucian made sure of that. He'd left enough evidence at the river to convince them we hadn't survived the fall, and with the water carrying our scent away, they had no way to track us. As far as they know, their justice was served. The rogue vampire and his human accomplice died together, which was probably the most romantic ending they could have imagined for us. But we're not dead. We're more alive than ever. We've started moving south, taking back roads, and staying in abandoned places. Learning to navigate this new life together. Lucian says we'll eventually find somewhere to settle. Somewhere remote enough that we can build a life without attracting attention. Maybe Alaska. Maybe the Scottish Highlands. Maybe some island no one's ever heard of. I miss being human sometimes. Miss the warmth of the sun on my skin, the taste of food, the simple pleasure of sleeping through the night. But I don't regret what I've become. Because this life, this strange and beautiful and terrifying life, is one I get to share with him. And that makes it worth everything I've lost. He's teaching me about the world he's seen, promising to show me all the places he described during those nights in my living room, Paris in springtime, the northern lights in Iceland, the temples of Kyoto. We have time now, all the time in the world, and we're going to use every moment of it. Sometimes I think about the life I left behind. My career as a surgeon, my apartment in Portland, the normal existence I'd built for myself. I wonder if anyone's looking for me, if my colleagues wonder where I went. But those thoughts feel distant now, like they belong to someone else. The woman I was died in that river. The woman I am now is something different, something more. Lucian tells me I'm stronger than he was when he was first turned. That I've adapted faster, controlled the hunger better, embraced what I've become instead of fighting it. He says it's because I chose this, or at least accepted it when it was done. That makes all the difference, apparently. Vampires who are turned against their will often go mad. But those who embrace the transformation, they thrive. I'm thriving, and so is he. For the first time in 300 years, Lucian isn't running from himself anymore. He's found peace, or something close to it. He smiles more easily now. Laughs at my jokes, talks about the future like it's something to look forward to rather than something to endure. I did that for him. Loving him changed him as much as his blood changed me. We make plans as we travel. Quiet plans, small plans, the kind of plans that normal couples make. Where we'll live, what we'll do with eternity, whether we'll try to make friends among other vampires or if we'll stay isolated. He says there are others like him out there, vampires who've rejected the Council's ways, who are trying to find a better path. Maybe someday we'll find them, build something new together, a different kind of family. But for now, it's just us. Two beings who shouldn't exist, shouldn't have survived, shouldn't have found each other. And yet, here we are, bloodbound. That's what Lucian calls it. The connection between us is deeper than love. Deeper than choice. It's written into our very essence. Vampire blood calling to vampire blood. We're linked now in a way that can never be broken, and I wouldn't have it any other way. I started this story by saying I needed to tell you something. Something that keeps me awake, though I don't really sleep anymore. The truth is more complex than I realized when I began. Because I'm not just telling you what happened to me. I'm trying to understand it myself. Trying to make sense of how a simple act of kindness on a rainy night led to this. I saved a stranger's life, and in doing so, I lost my own. But I also gained something I never expected. something I didn't know I needed. I found someone who sees me, truly sees me, in a way no one ever has before. Someone who would risk everything, would break every rule he'd set for himself just to keep me safe. And I found out that I'm capable of the same kind of fierce, reckless love. The world thinks we're dead. My family, if I'd had any left, would mourn me. My colleagues would wonder what happened to the dedicated surgeon who just disappeared one day. But Eleanor the human is gone. What remains is Eleanor the vampire. Ellie, forever frozen at 32, with ember and gold eyes that mirror Lucian's and a heart that beats maybe 10 times per minute. Am I still alive? That's the question I posed at the beginning, and I think the answer is yes. Maybe more alive than I ever was before. Because now, every moment is precious. Every night is a gift. Every dawn we survive together is a victory against the Council, against fate, against everything that tried to keep us apart. Do I belong to his world now? Absolutely. But he belongs to mine too. We've created something new together, a space that's neither human nor vampire, but somehow both. A life built on the ruins of everything we were before, stronger for having been broken and rebuilt. I don't know what the future holds. We could be discovered tomorrow. The Council could send more hunters, and this time we might not escape. Or we could have centuries together, watching the world change around us while we remain constant. Either way, I'm not afraid anymore, because I'm not facing it alone. Last night, we stood together watching the stars from a hilltop somewhere in Montana. Lucian pointed out constellations I'd never noticed before, told me stories about the myths behind them, and I realized that this is what forever looks like. Not grand gestures or epic romance, but quiet moments of connection. Two people, or two creatures, or two souls, whatever we are now, choosing each other over and over again. He turned to me in that moment and asked if I regretted any of it. The transformation, the running, the loss of my human life. I told him the truth. That I'd stop for him on that rainy highway because I couldn't bear to lose someone else. That I'd saved him because saving people was all I knew how to do. And that he'd saved me right back in ways I was still discovering. Regret? No, I don't regret any of it. Even the pain, even the fear, even the moment I died in that freezing river and was reborn as something new, because all of it led here, to this hilltop, to his hand in mine, to the understanding that love isn't about being the same. It's about choosing to become something new together. We're bloodbound now, connected in ways that go beyond words, beyond human understanding. His blood flows through my veins. My essence is mixed with his. We're not just together. We're part of each other. And that bond will last as long as we do, possibly forever. So am I alive? Yes. Am I human? No. Do I belong to his world? Yes. But he belongs to mine too. And together, we're creating something that belongs to both of us. A future that's uncertain, dangerous, and absolutely worth fighting for. This is my story. The story of how I found a man bleeding on the side of the road and brought him home. How I fell in love with a vampire who'd spent 40 years trying not to be a monster. How I died and was reborn into a life I never imagined. How we survived when we shouldn't have. How we found each other against all odds. And it's not over. This isn't an ending. It's just the beginning of something longer, something stranger, something more beautiful than anything I could have planned for myself. We have all of eternity to figure out what comes next, and I can't wait to see where it leads us. Thank you for listening, for staying with me through this impossible tale. I hope it makes you think about the choices you make, the strangers you help, the love you might find in the most unexpected places. Because you never know what might happen when you stop for someone on a dark road. You might just save their life, or they might save yours. If you want to hear more of our story, more about the life we're building together, the other vampires we might meet, the challenges we'll face, Let me know in the comments. There's so much more to tell, so many nights ahead of us, so many adventures waiting, and I'd love to share them with you. Until next time, remember, the world is stranger than you think, more beautiful, more dangerous, more full of possibility. And sometimes, the best thing you can do is take a chance on the impossible. This is Eleanor, signing off. From somewhere in the mountains, from a life I never expected. From forever. Epilogue. 6 months have passed since I recorded that last message. 6 months of traveling, hiding, learning what it means to be one of the bloodbound. And I wanted to give you an update, because things have changed. We found them. The others, Lucian mentioned. Vampires who've rejected the Council's ways, who are trying to build something better. There are more than we expected. Dozens, maybe hundreds, scattered across the world. Quiet revolutionaries who believe that vampires can evolve beyond their predatory nature, that we can find ways to survive without killing. We're not alone anymore. We've joined a community that's working toward change. It's slow work, dangerous work. The Council still hunts us when they can, but we're growing stronger, more organized, more hopeful that someday vampires and humans might find a way to coexist, that we might build a world where neither side has to fear the other. Lucian is different now. The guilt that weighed on him for decades has started to lift. He's found purpose again, working with the other reformed vampires to develop alternatives to human blood. Better ways to sustain ourselves. He's even teaching younger vampires, the ones who returned recently, and are struggling with what they've become. He tells them the same thing he told me, that what you are doesn't define you. It's what you choose to do with it that matters. As for me, I'm learning to be a doctor again. Not in the traditional sense, obviously, but this community needs healers who understand vampire physiology, who can help when one of us is injured, who can research better ways for us to survive. My medical training hasn't been wasted, it's just being applied in ways I never imagined. We have a home now, a real home, not just a hiding place. It's in Alaska, like Lucian thought it might be. A compound where dozens of reformed vampires live together, protected by distance and secrecy. We have solar power, satellite internet, everything we need to connect with the outside world while remaining hidden from it. It's not perfect, but it's ours. Sometimes I think about the night I stopped for Lucian. How different my life would be if I'd just driven past. I'd still be human, still working at St. Catherine's, still lonely. Still broken in ways I didn't want to acknowledge. Would that have been better? Safer? More normal? Maybe. But it wouldn't have been this. It wouldn't have been love that transformed me completely. It wouldn't have been finding my place in a community that's trying to change the world. It wouldn't have been forever with someone who sees me more clearly than anyone ever has. The future is uncertain. The Council is still out there, still hunting vampires who break their laws. There will be more battles, more close calls, more nights when we're not sure we'll see the next one. But we'll face them together. The bloodbound. Not just Lucian and me anymore, but all of us who've chosen a different path. And that's the real story I wanted to share with you, not just a romance between a human and a vampire, but a story about choosing hope over fear. About believing that change is possible even when the odds seem insurmountable. About finding family in the most unexpected places and building something new from the ruins of what came before. So yes, I'm still alive, more alive than ever. Still bloodbound to the man I saved on that rainy highway. Still working toward a future that might seem impossible, but that we're determined to create anyway. And if you're out there reading this, if you've stayed with me through this entire impossible tale, then maybe you're ready to believe in the impossible too. Maybe you're ready to take a chance on something that doesn't make sense, to help a stranger, to choose love over fear, to build something new, Because that's what this story is really about. Not vampires or supernatural abilities or eternal life. It's about the choices we make when we're faced with the unexpected. About the kindness we show to strangers. About the love we're brave enough to fight for. Thank you for being part of this journey. For listening to my story. For believing in the possibility of something more. And remember, the next time you see someone who needs help, the next time you're faced with a choice between safety and compassion, think about what might happen if you take the risk. You might just change someone's life, or they might change yours. This is Eleanor, still here, still fighting, still bloodbound, and still grateful for the rainy night that changed everything. Stay safe out there. And remember, the world is more magical than you think. Forever yours, from the shadows. The end.